Long before the world heard of Babylon or Assyria, there was another people stirring in the ancient land of Mesopotamia. To the south, the Sumerians had already built great cities like Uruk, and Lagash. Their temples rose high above the flat plains, their priests recorded offerings on clay tablets, and their kings fought endless battles over canals and fields. But not far from them, in the central and northern parts of the land between the rivers, another people had begun to grow. These were the Akkadians. The Akkadians spoke a Semitic language, different from the Sumerian tongue, but they didn't arrive as invaders. For generations, they lived side by side with the Sumerians, learning from them, trading with them, even adopting many of their customs. Akkadian scribes wrote in cuneiform. Their temples were built like those of their southern neighbors. But behind this cultural blend, a shift was happening. The Akkadians were growing in power and ambition. They were no longer content to remain in the shadow of Sumer. In time, one man would rise among them and change everything. His name would be remembered for thousands of years, and his empire would become the first of its kind in history. His name was Sargon. Sargon of Akkad didn't begin his life in a palace. In fact, much of his early story is filled with mystery and legend. It's said he was born of humble origins, perhaps even placed in a basket and set adrift on a river, eventually rescued and raised by a gardener. Whether or not that's true, what matters is what he became. Sargon rose through the ranks in the city of Kish, a Sumerian city in central Mesopotamia. He started as a cupbearer to the king, a position of trust that gave him access to power, and from there, he made his move. Around 2334 BCE, Sargon overthrew the ruler of Kish and began a campaign that would reshape the map of Mesopotamia. He marched south, defeating the kings of Uruk, and Lagash, city after city, falling under his control. But Sargon didn't stop there. He continued north and west, bringing vast territories under his command, reaching as far as the Mediterranean Sea. For the first time, the lands of Sumer and Akkad, along with distant regions beyond, were ruled by a single king. This was more than conquest. It was the beginning of empire. Sargon declared himself the king of the four quarters of the world, a title that spoke to a new kind of authority, one not limited to a city-state or even a region. His capital, Akkad, became the heart of this new political order, though its exact location remains lost today. Sargon organized his empire with governors loyal to him, a standing army, and a network of trade that stretched from the Persian Gulf to Anatolia. This was the birth of imperial rule, something the world would see again and again throughout history. But here, with Sargon, it was still new. His legacy wouldn't end with his death. His descendants would carry on his dream. And yet, even in its early years, the empire faced challenges that would test its strength. After Sargon passed, his dream didn't die with him. His empire, now the largest the world had ever seen up to that point, was passed on to his sons and grandsons. The most notable among them was Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, who would take Akkadian power to even greater heights. Naram-Sin wasn't just a ruler, he saw himself as something more. His reign marked a shift in how kings presented their authority. While earlier kings had always placed themselves beneath the gods, Naram-Sin did something revolutionary. He declared himself a living god. It was bold, perhaps even dangerous, but it showed how powerful the Akkadian throne had become. On his famous stele, carved in stone, Naram-Sin is shown towering above his enemies, wearing a horned helmet, the symbol of divine status in Mesopotamia. But his divine claim wasn't just for show. Naram-Sin led campaigns far and wide. He crushed rebellions in the Zagros Mountains, pushed into Anatolia, and maintained control over a vast and diverse empire. Trade flourished under his rule. Goods flowed in from every direction, silver from Anatolia, timber from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Akkad stood at the center of a web of commerce and culture, and with that wealth came great cities. The Akkadians built temples, palaces, and infrastructure on a scale not seen before. Their language, Akkadian, started to replace Sumerian in daily life and record keeping. Cuneiform tablets from this time show a shift toward a unified imperial culture. The Akkadians didn't just conquer, they connected. They fused Sumerian traditions with their own Semitic roots, creating something new. But as always, success brought new dangers. The farther an empire stretches, the harder it is to hold. And beneath the surface of this golden age, cracks were beginning to form. As the Akkadian Empire expanded, it began to face the same challenge that haunts all great powers: how to hold it all together. The empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, a vast web of cities, tribes, and trade routes. But with size came instability. Distant provinces began to rebel. Local rulers wanted independence. The longer the roads, the harder it was to enforce the king's will. Naram-Sin, for all his strength, could not stop the tide forever. His later years were marked by uprisings and unrest. And then came something that no army could fight: a devastating drought. The rains stopped, the rivers shrank, crops failed across Mesopotamia. Archaeologists believe this drought may have lasted decades. Entire cities were abandoned. People fled from the countryside to the cities, searching for food, water, and safety. But the cities could barely feed their own. As if that wasn't enough, new enemies began pressing in from the north and east. The Akkadians, fierce mountain people from the Zagros range, swept into Mesopotamia. They weren't organized like the Akkadians. They didn't build cities or write in cuneiform. But they were relentless. Weakened by famine, rebellion, and overreach, the Akkadian Empire couldn't stop them. By around 2150 BCE, the once mighty empire began to unravel. Cities that had once stood proudly under Akkadian banners now fell into ruin or rose up against the central power. Naram-Sin's successors couldn't hold the line. One by one, the provinces broke away. Eventually, even the heartland of Akkad was overrun. The empire collapsed, and with it, the first great experiment in uniting Mesopotamia under one rule came to an end. But the story doesn't end there. The Akkadians had changed Mesopotamia forever. Their language, their art, their way of governing, they didn't vanish. In the centuries that followed, new kingdoms would rise from the ashes, building on what the Akkadians had started. Even though the Akkadian Empire had crumbled, its influence didn't disappear with it. In fact, the Akkadians left behind something more powerful than armies or palaces: a legacy of ideas. Their language, Akkadian, became the common tongue of diplomacy, trade, and government across Mesopotamia for over 1,000 years. It replaced Sumerian as the main language in daily life, even as Sumerian continued to be used in religious and scholarly settings. Akkadian writing, carved into clay tablets in sharp, wedge-shaped cuneiform, carried myths, laws, and royal proclamations far and wide. Through this language, epic tales like the Epic of Gilgamesh were preserved and retold. Kings who came after Sargon and Naram-Sin looked back at them as the gold standard of rule. They studied the old tablets, copied their titles, and built monuments in the same style. The city of Akkad may have vanished. Its exact location still hasn't been found, but its spirit echoed through the centuries. The way Sargon organized the empire, with governors, tax systems, and military control, became the model for later Mesopotamian powers like the Babylonians and the Assyrians. They took what the Akkadians had started and expanded on it, building even greater cities and more complex empires. Even the Akkadians, who had overthrown the Akkadians, didn't last long. Within a few generations, they too were pushed aside. A new dynasty emerged in southern Mesopotamia, the kings of who revived many Akkadian traditions. They rebuilt temples, collected taxes, and tried to reunite the land, inspired by the memory of Akkad. Today, when we look back at the Akkadians, we see the first real empire in history. Not just a city-state or a regional power, but a system that reached across cultures, connected far-off lands, and set the stage for everything that came after. It was a bold experiment, sometimes brutal, sometimes brilliant, that showed just how far ambition and vision could reach in the ancient world.